Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the To Live Woke Diversity Education Series. My name is Andrea Sellers, and I am the Assistant Director for Regional Engagement. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight on behalf of the NC State Alumni Association. Just a friendly reminder to please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit any questions you may have throughout the webinar. The recording of this webinar will be emailed out to all registrants once it is posted live to YouTube following the conclusion of this event. This will be a 75-minute webinar, and joining us again tonight is the delightful Lyndenise Berdecia. We are so excited to have you again. She is a proud alumna of NC State's Poole College of Management, and she has also served as a PAC Partners representative for South Florida for over 11 years. She is also the co-chair of the Latinx Alumni Network and supports the Poole Diversity Fund and initiatives. After her time in NC State, Lyndenise went on to get her master's in international political economy from the University of Miami. Additionally, as a founder and chief educator of Birdhouse, Lyndenise brings experience in business development, career coaching, creative strategy, digital marketing, and higher education to the conversation. Lyndenise, we're so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here with all of you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I would love to introduce Dr. Nacoste. NC State's Dr. Rupert Nacoste teaches a widely popular social psychology course called Interpersonal Relationships and Race. His new book, To Live Woke, uses his experiences from growing up in segregated Louisiana to serving in the US Navy to help us understand that we need to learn to interact with people who are not like us, whether because of race, religion, sexual orientation, or any number of other differences. And today we'll be reading over chapter 27. So I'll hand it off to Dr. Nacoste and then we'll continue on the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndenise, and good evening, everyone. I have given our chapters for tonight, chapters 24 through 31, the theme Neodiversity, Anxiety, Activating Bigotry. When I teach, I'm an orator. Even over Zoom, you can hear the big boom of my voice. But what makes my teaching captivate my students is that each lecture has a clear theme and a clear story. What my students don't really know is that to set that up, I give each of my lectures a story title. One of the lectures I give in my Interdependence, Interpersonal Relationships, and Race course is, Why Are They So Sensitive? In it, I take on the put down used to try to say that people from certain groups are just being too sensitive. That is a social strategy. It is a dodge. It's a strategic way to avoid self-examination. What activates this motivation to avoid self-examination? What makes self-examination so hard to face? It turns out it's the same problem people have with self-examination in their general interpersonal relationships. No relationship problem is ever just one person's problem. Each person makes a contribution to the relationship problem. In fact, avoidance of self-examination is one way people contribute to the problems in their relationship. Why is that avoidance so common then? We social psychologists call it objective self-awareness. It is a state of consciousness in which we are psychologically focused on our failings. It is a state of consciousness where something has forced us to see the discrepancy between our ideal self and our real self. And that objective self-awareness can cause people to lash out and blame others. Today, we live with neodiversity, an interpersonal situation in which we all have to encounter and sometimes interact with people not like us on some group dimension. Turns out, we now know a neodiverse interaction moment can cause neodiversity anxiety. In that neodiversity anxiety is the question, am I interacting the right way? And that question can push people into that state of objective self-awareness. When that happens, too many people lash out at the person not like them. Too many Americans lately have lashed out by calling the police. Here then is chapter 27 of To Live Woke, Call the Police. Hello, police? Please have someone come to this address because when we see the video, when the video story goes viral, many Americans cringe. Wait, what? Someone called the cops because an 8-year-old Black girl was selling bottled water on the street to make a little pocket change. 2 Black men were sitting in Starbucks, quietly waiting for a friend, but asked to use the restroom. A Black graduate student had fallen asleep in a common area of a graduate residence hall. At Colorado State University, campus police pulled 2 American Indian teenage boys from a campus tour because a white parent on the tour called 911 to report that the boys were being too quiet and were wearing dark stuff, and all that was suspicious. What is the culprit here? We all know the word racist is overused and used mostly without accuracy. Prejudice is not bigotry, it is not racism. Prejudice is a negative and unfavorable set of feelings and judgments about a whole group of people. Bigotry occurs when those feelings appear in behavior, avoidance, and other forms of behavioral discrimination. Racism is a system of laws or policies that support and authorize individual prejudice and bigotry. Not racism, but racial bigotry is at work because we do know these calling the cops incidences are racial. Still, you have to wonder why people are calling the cops for these innocuous social encounters. Racial prejudice is not new. We all know there was a long period in our nation during which racial segregation was the rule of the day, the law of the land. Everything in everyday life was segregated by race. Myself, a dark-skinned Black man born in 1951, Louisiana, I grew up during the days of legal segregation. That is a personal, experience-based reason that I know that to say everything was segregated is no exaggeration. People think of schools when it comes to legal racial segregation, and that is accurate. At the same time, though, laws of segregation also apply to doctor's office waiting rooms, hospitals, public bathrooms, movie theaters, department stores, public parks, and pools. As a nation, we got rid of those immoral laws. We got rid of that racism. Yet desegregation by law was not just simply or immediately accepted into the everyday behavior or psychology of individuals, especially given the long history of legally enforced segregation. With desegregation, there were Americans who felt uncomfortable being in a park, not to mention being in a pool with Black Americans. In fact, with the dismantling of segregation, some municipalities closed their public swimming pools so that Blacks and whites would not be in the same water to swim. That psychological discomfort did not go away with the eventual fact of not being able to avoid being in proximity of Black people at work or play. Truth is, there still are those who feel racial prejudice that leads to a preference for social distance between white and Black people, preferring not to have Black people around. So too is the fact that in some families, that prejudice continues to be reinforced and passed on. The spring of 2018 semester, I had a white student who reported an experience of working in a summer camp. 2 7-year-old children, one Black and one white, were put together to work on a project. The little white girl was clearly uncomfortable. When asked what was wrong, the 7-year-old white girl said, "My daddy said I can't play with people like them." That prejudice had been in family talk at home, watching TV over meals, and by way of directives about who a child should play with by skin color. Poet W.H. Auden put it this way: evil is unspectacular, always human, shares our bed and eats at our own table. Nurtured at home, that prejudice lived and slept in social hibernation as long as the child stayed at home. Yet children and grown-ups have to leave the house sometime. Out there in the neodiversity reality of our time, neodiversity is this 21st century interpersonal situation where all of us have to encounter and sometimes interact with people not like us on some group dimension. That neodiversity reality can create a neurodiversity interaction anxiety, an uneasy feeling in the presence of someone from one of those not like me groups. Our mistake today is that rather than admit that the family talk, the family directives were inappropriate, disrespectful, and un-American, too many people want to fix America to fit that way of talking about them. Too many do not want to admit that the family talk has left their children and themselves unprepared for everyday encounters with neurodiversity, encounters in everyday situations with people not like me. Look, we know that over the last 20 years, Americans have become more anxious about diversity. To quote the news story from 2013, diversity is on the rise in America and people are very anxious about it, according to a sweeping new Esquire NBC News survey. A concrete example is interracial dating and marriage. With its increase in occurrence, nearly 20% of Americans still say that interracial marriage is morally wrong. That psychological stance must fill those people with anxiety as they encounter interracial couples in TV shows and commercials, walking through grocery and department stores, in parks, and at the neighborhood swimming pool. In today's digital world, that neurodiversity anxiety is exploding through communication technology. In the old days, when a person felt anxiety about them being in close proximity, all a person could do was either accept it or move out of that situation. Surely you would not ask someone to call the police because you would expect that whomever you ask would ask you why. What's the trouble? Today, with a reach into your pocket and the push of 3 numbers, your neurodiversity anxiety is quickly and easily unmuzzled into behavior. Hello, police? With no need of other people. Cell phones released all of us from normal social impulse control to call the police for a reason that amounts to, I feel really anxious because there are Black people here. And hear me, no matter what the executives at Starbucks believe, what is going on is not unconscious bias. Most Americans have now seen the outrage-inducing video of the police taking away in handcuffs 2 Black men who had been sitting quietly in a Philadelphia Starbucks waiting for a friend. With no other provocation, a Starbucks employee called the police because those 2 Black men sitting in the store had not placed an order and asked to use the restroom. Kevin Johnson, the CEO of Starbucks, published a public letter of apology. He says a number of things, but this line of thinking stuck out to me. He says, "We have immediately begun a thorough investigation of our practices. Regretfully, our practices and training led to a bad outcome. The basis for the call to the Philadelphia Police Department was wrong. Our store manager never intended for these men to be arrested, and this should never have escalated as it did. We also will further train our partners to better know when police assistance is warranted." That line of thinking misses the problem. To say that our store manager never intended for these men to be arrested raises an important question about the manager's psychology in the moment. What was the manager's intention for calling the police? To say that it was all unintentional is also how we get to Starbucks deciding to do a day of unconscious bias training. Unconscious? Refusing to admit and examine your racial or other neurodiversity anxieties does not turn those anxieties into unconscious bias. You know what you feel. You are just engaged in dangerous denial. It is dangerous because the neurodiversity anxiety is sleeping right under the surface of our everyday social encounters. With the right situational noise, that neurodiversity anxiety will roar awake from its hibernation, and in panic, someone will call the police. The problem today is not race relations per se or unconscious bias. Too many of we Americans have become sneetches, so frantic with worry about whether this one was that one or what one was who, that for no good reason the police are called. The problem is getting people to admit, acknowledge, and examine the origins of and manage their neurodiversity anxiety. That is an anxiety about who belongs in what spaces. That is the anxiety of who are among the we and who are among the they. That is the anxiety that is the American intergroup problem of our time, our newest American dilemma. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do it like we did last time. This is needed, and I know everyone is joining me. Many times when we look at conversations about neurodiversity, the different, panels that we've had, or even just discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, it can be very uncomfortable for many people. And I think what's important about this series and what's important about the people joining us this evening, that it's about having these open discussions where we're allowed to ask questions, where we're allowed to say, hey, I really don't know, but I would really like to ask this question. Maybe I don't feel comfortable to ask a colleague or ask a friend. And this is really an important space to do that. And so thank you, Dr. Nacoste, for allowing us, this safe space, which I always like to highlight, because this is really just an opportunity for us to have this discussion so that everyone can have a key takeaway or takeaways so that they can then plant those seeds in discussions with their families, with their friends, with their colleagues. And that's really where the change will come.
Mm-hmm.
And so, looking at the importance of this discussion, I did want, since you did, chapter 27 is about police. I just really wanted to, just emphasize how people don't really, realize how bringing the police into situations with Black and Brown folks, how that becomes dangerous, right? We have, as you mentioned, all of these videos circulating on social media. But I did want to at least acknowledge a few of those, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, Stephen Clark, Botham Jean, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, and the list can go as long as this discussion. And, I think that what we all want to understand is at what point is enough? Right. And this really goes into, the discussion, especially with the elections around the corner. Do we rely on politicians, on lawmakers, on community leaders to make a difference? Or how do we force people to listen, if at all? And so this is one question that was submitted, and I think it's very poignant and very important to this discussion. And the question goes, given the cultural movement in today's society and guided by the enduring words of Dr. Martin Luther King when he stated, a riot is the language of the unheard. Do you agree that riots are necessary when protests go unheard?
So what I would say is this: conflict is necessary. And there are various forms of conflict. Why is conflict necessary? Well, it's the same idea that it has to do with interpersonal relationships. That's why my approach is interpersonal relationships and race. So interpersonal relationships never evolve until the dyad, the two people, have conflict. Otherwise, it's just two ships passing in the night. So it turns out interpersonal conflict is an opportunity to clarify the relationship. Now, there are different forms of conflict. It can be conflict in a meeting. It can be conflict on the street. Conflict on the street is the highest, most extreme form of that unheard voice. But various forms of conflict need to happen. So I'm not advocating one or the other. I'm just saying that it has to happen for us to wake up and say, okay, wait, there really is a problem. Anybody who's been in a relationship, friendship, romantic, anybody who's been in a relationship knows that the relationship starts to stagnate if people don't engage each other, if people don't say, by the way, you need to stop doing that. Or at least, so let's talk about why, what is going on? So that's what we're experiencing right now. We're in another one of these periods, and it's not the first. People must understand that. We're in another one of those periods where the racial intergroup, now neurodiverse clash is happening at a really heightened level. And we see evidence of it, and we can see evidence of it because of cell phones. And that's pushing it. That's pushing it, and that is necessary for change, positive change.
And that goes right into my next point, where that we see, videos circulating on social media about being Black by just bird watching, renting an Airbnb, going to the library, walking in your own neighborhood. I think the most recent video was that someone approached two Black men and said, this is a no-N zone. And this is 2020. And as you mentioned, this isn't the first time, but because we have videos and because we have cameras, this is the first time that people are actually, it's in front of them because, you know, it's on your news, it's, you know, on social media. And so do you consider things like the Karen Act? I think San Francisco was the first city.
Oh, yeah.
That where essentially, for those that aren't familiar with the Karen Act, is where they're essentially making racial bias calls. So these unnecessary 911 calls to the police, illegal and potentially a hate crime. Do you think that this is a good start? Again, conflict is essential and it's necessary, but is something like this a good start?
That's a really interesting question, and I do have mixed feelings. I think what is happening is that the push is so strong, it's so hard, there's a tendency to, we got to do something. So I don't know how carefully people have thought through this policy change. I don't know. I'm not in California. I've read about it, but I don't know. So something has to be done. Something has to be done to alert the community that this is not acceptable behavior. Is that the way to do it? In the most extreme cases, I think it is, up to a point. Should every township, municipality do that? I don't think so. I think it depends on the extent of the problem in your neighborhood, in your municipality, in your township. I think each set of citizens into conversation with town leaders and make it very clear that they found this unacceptable and that something must be done.
Absolutely. And so this, brings me to another question from one of our viewers. And I think this is certainly one of those that it's all about understanding what the terms are. And I think that, when you broke it down, racism is not bigotry, and so on. I think this, the whole, especially now with the elections as well. And I think that, having this discussion, we can't stay away from the elections coming up. But can we dive into, the question is defunding the police an unfortunate term? Perhaps demilitarizing the police would be better?
So let's talk about that. Let me start this way. When people call the police and say they don't intend for the police to act the way they have, the first thing you need to say is, one, the police have one job and they have one way of dealing with that job. So if you call the police, somebody's going to get arrested. So the idea that you didn't think they would get arrested is silly. You're dodging what you've just done. Second, because the police are just like the military, and I served in the military. So if you call the military, we're coming, but we're coming one way and we're coming in hot. So if that's not what you have in mind, don't call the police. Okay. Second, the police in America have become militarized. That is, they become more like a military force. That is unfortunate. And that's why people wanted to talk about defunding, because there's a lot of money that goes into a police force having a tank. Okay, what? Okay. But defunding is an unfortunate term because it sounds like you're saying we're going to take all the money away from the police. And that's not what defunding was intended to mean. But again, what did I just say about people rushing? I mean, this is a hot moment and people, we got to do something. And then somebody said defund, and somebody said, yeah, defund, let's do that. Ah, okay. Is that really what you mean? What we now know people are talking about is saying, let's redistribute some of the money that we put into the police, into forces, into groups, agencies that can help the police. That's a different statement. So defunding is definitely an unfortunate choice of words.
And I also think that because, now with the climate that we're in, of course, the elections, people are also not understanding that there is the term is abolishing the police, which is obviously the more extreme side, which there are people that believe that, right? There are people that believe that, but defunding is to address A Black man was killed, this weekend because of a mental health crisis, and so there's a lot of ways that, can de-escalate certain situations. But if your first point of contact is the police, as opposed to another number, and I think there's a couple of cities that have implemented or
de-escalate.
Exactly, of de-escalating by having a separate number. So as opposed to 911, it would be a separate number that they can call to de-escalate the situation, especially if it's a mental health crisis, right? Which happens. And so there's certainly
Let me say something about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Go ahead. Well, look, let me say something about this. It turns out people think, well, you can't really do that. Well, the truth is the military did that. The United States Navy did exactly that. There's a thing called shore patrol. They are the police. And during the time I was in, because of all the racial stuff, we knew that the shore patrol was going to act one way and that you couldn't control that in terms of their racial bias. So the Navy created an additional force, human relations action. I was on the human relations action team and I walked shore patrol in civilian clothes, and my job was to do exactly that, de-escalate. Between sailors and other sailors, but sailors and citizens of the town we happen to be ported in. So if the military can do it, nobody can tell me a police force can't, a city can't do it.
Absolutely. It's important to be honest. I think just in these conversations, but also with ourselves, right? There are a lot of people that feel like these times are difficult to live in, but the reality is that police brutality is nothing new. The difference is now, as we mentioned, is because we can actually document it on cameras and videos. And not just that, but it's that it doesn't take weeks for someone to access it, right? It takes seconds. Because now you can, activate your Facebook Live in the middle of, a police stop. And here, next thing you know, there's so many other people that are involved in that particular moment. And so where can you share what's happening to you in just a moment? So looking at, kind of your upbringing in segregated Louisiana, would love to share, for you to share a little bit more about how did police hinder or help in the integration in Louisiana while you were growing up, if you don't mind sharing some of those experiences.
Experiences of segregation?
Yes, if at all, police hindered or helped the segregation.
Oh, I see.
Integration while you were in segregated Louisiana.
Yeah. Well, one of the things people have been asking me about, what am I seeing now that has lingered? And the truth is, the one thing that has disappointed me is the way police are acting. Now, in my day, if you were an African-American man, you couldn't be on the police force until almost the time I graduated from high school, which was 1969. But my father was a deputy sheriff. And that changed the police force. Up until then, you're right. It was the same old, same old. But as soon as you added African-Americans to that force, it changed the tenor of things. So one of my disappointments is that somehow has seemed to have gone away, or it doesn't have the same impact. So from the segregation days, it was pretty awful. I have my students read I mentioned this, Tim Tyson's Blood Done Sign My Name, about Oxford, North Carolina, in a racial murder. And the police were a big part of how awful that situation became. But in my growing up and moving through segregation and into the military, I sensed a change. It was a hard change, but I sensed things changing. And then I, like many others, stopped paying attention to it. And now it looks like, holy moly, something was growing. And what we have now is something that we can see very clearly by way of cell phones. So there is some strong similarity that really shouldn't be there, that is there.
Thank you. One of the articles, I think it was either an article that you shared or one of your lectures. Again, I shared with you that I essentially purchased everything that's available from the bookstore. So I did support the bookstore. And so one of the articles, I want to say that you either referenced or you recommended to your students was about by Lauren Aratani, Coughing While Asian, Living in Fear as Racism Feeds Off the Coronavirus Pandemic.
Coronavirus.
Yes. And so the current president feeds on this fear. And I know that we talked about fear on all the different discussions because it's the fear of neurodiversity and kind of getting over that fear and having these discussions. And so, you know, the current president feeds off on this fear by calling the virus the Chinese virus, for example. Yes. It's not really hatred that the most operative emotion regarding dangerous speech, it's fear. Fear of what makes people turn violently against another group of people more than hatred. The level of fear is so great around this epidemic. And so that was a quote from that article. And so how do we address this, especially now? And this also goes to, you know, one of the questions that we have is, you know, I'm the least racist person in the room. So how can we, you know, look at it from, you know, what we're living all today in coronavirus, how they're feeding off this fear, but also by understanding like, okay, well, you're feeding off this fear, but at the same time, you're saying that you're the least racist person in the room. Would love your thoughts on that.
Well, so one of the things that's really interesting about that is the way we have messed up and confused concepts. So let's go back to prejudice is not bigotry, is not racism. So prejudice is feelings. It's feelings. It's anti-group feelings that can include anxiety. Bigotry is how you let it come out in your behavior. The other stuff is systems. So let's talk about President Trump. President Trump feeds on, as a political tool, prejudice and bigotry against neodiversity. He pushes it. You're absolutely right. Now, when people ask me about him, they say, well, he's a racist. I go, okay. Prejudice is not bigotry, is not racism. He's using it as a tool. He's creating fear. Does that make him a racist? No. However, he has instituted policies because he has the power to create systems. So he is in a position that allows him to do it all. He can push the fear. He can make people think they are out to get you, that you're going to lose. I mean, there are commercials now that show a woman going to a car and she's being attacked and the police won't come because they've been defunded. And it's like, oh my God. But it's just pushing fear, 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 fear. That's using prejudice and bigotry as a fear tool. The thing and that's something we really should pay attention to. But we really should also have been paying attention to the policies, executive orders. I mean, when people started talking about it, the Muslim ban, that is the ban on people traveling from certain countries, that's a policy system issue. So what do we attack? Well, what we attack at the fear level is in ourselves. Self-examination, as I say in this chapter on calling the police, is hard. But each of us must take on the responsibility of being responsible for our own levels of anti-group fear and not just let it happen to us so that we end up being one of those people calling the police. But that's up to the individual. People say they want America to be better. Well, that means you've got to do some psychological work on yourself. On yourself. You can't run from the self-examination. One of the things I emphasize in all my books and all my teaching, there are no innocent. You just heard me say, evil is unspectacular and always human. Shares our bed and eats at our own table. We must do self-examination of ourselves, self-examination of talk at our dinner table, self-examination of our conversations with coworkers. That's how we manage that attempt to use us by way of fear. And then, so that's one thing, self-examination. And then we have to be activists with our local municipalities. We have to go to city council meetings. What is the city council doing about the way the police are behaving? What are the new policies? So there's a two-pronged approach that has to be taken. And it is work. It is work.
I think that, you see a lot of these articles and a lot of discussions and Facebook Lives, Instagram Lives, where they talk about what is there to do to fix America. And I think that it's important that the question shouldn't be what is there to do to fix America, but what is there to do to fix ourselves? And it ties into all the discussions that we've had and that your series has had, is really that self-examination and understanding what are we doing to feed this fear, right? Or what are we doing to resolve?
Passivity in this time is a problem. Like, well, what can I do? What do you mean, what can you do? What are you letting your coworkers say around you? What are you saying that's feeding this hostility? One of the chapters is on Dylan Roof, who killed 9 African-American people in a church. But when his friends were interviewed, so-called friends, they said, yeah, he used to talk like that all the time. But we didn't think he was serious. We thought it was just joking. Yeah, but the man got a gun and killed 9 people. That means he wasn't just joking. And people let this stuff pass and say, oh, they don't mean it that way. Yeah, they do. And what is your role in letting that go on? But you have to self-examine, and then you have to be willing to step out, step into that moment and stand up against bigotry. That's one of the things we all must do now.
John Adams, thanks for joining. He has a question. Well, it's a comment and a question, so I want to make sure that it actually ties in perfectly with what we're discussing now. When there is a disconnect between neurodiversity and what is talked about at home, at a dinner table, or in other domestic situations, how could diversity education at an early age relieve the anxiety that occurs when confronted with, as you mentioned, the other within neurodiversity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important question, because I think that's one of the things we have to start working on. The disconnect. So that means you recognize that your world is segregated. You recognize that there's not been interactions that help your children and grandchildren learn how to manage neurodiversity interactions. Okay, that's the first thing to do. Acknowledge that. That's real. Then what? Education, what does that mean? Well, self-education in the home. There are lots of books. One of my favorite books to recommend for young kids is by Julius Lester. What is the meaning of color? And it's a beautiful book, and it's for kids, and it walks them through this idea that, oh, we're all different colors. Does that mean something? And in the end, it's all about a rainbow, and we're all part of the rainbow. So so that's at a kid level. And you can talk about that with your kid, with your grandkid, so that they're not afraid of skin color or accents. There's something about accents. So there are things that people have to take personal responsibility for in terms of creating social change in America. It's not all big stuff. There's big stuff for sure, but not all of us are going to be working on the big stuff, but we can all work on the so-called small stuff, the purely interpersonal stuff. So what's the conversation at the dinner table? What happens when your 3-year-old comes back from school and uses a word that is like, oh, because they're learning stuff at school, right? They're peers. You have to address that. How do you address it? You don't just say, oh, you can't say that. No. You have to start having a conversation about, okay, here's why that's a problem. And here's why we hope that as a member of our family, make it group oriented, that you understand that we would like you not to use that kind of language, because that language has a history, and you can talk about the history. But personal responsibility is a huge part of this.
Absolutely. And we discussed this also before, the importance of saying that, I can't use the excuse of the way that I was raised or I didn't know. It's all about utilizing that opportunity to ask questions, to engage in discussion. And really, this goes not just from a personal or as the question had asked on a domestic level, but also at work. When someone is speaking to someone else about someone else, mentioning something derogatory or, utilizing women as sales tools, like there's so many things that we can, uncover just in that. And so another audience member asked, how do you recommend responding to poor rural white people who feel neglected by the government and therefore resent benefits given to Black and brown people to erase past racial harms?
So that goes back to this thing about fear and anxiety and pushing fear, because the truth is, those poor white people are just like poor Black people. But what they've been told is, what they've been led to believe is that the Black people who are poor get more stuff illegitimately. Okay, so that's a real problem. It's poor rural. I grew up poor rural. And so I know that world. People feel resentment when you give them resentment. And we have to work on developing leaders and putting leaders in place who manage that in a much better way, in a very different way. That's a long process, but we've got to start working on it.
Also going back to, you had mentioned self-examination. There are a lot of comments actually about that. And one of them is from Laverne. It's a statement essentially, and then I have a question to follow. As Dr. Nacoste said, to challenge prejudice, one must engage in self-reflection to change prejudice and bigotry. But our current president seems to have no ability for self-reflection, which is still very fearful, right, for us, and obviously the future of this country. And so understanding how to interact with one another, usually people in certain positions of power, again, in this case, they were mentioning the president, but looking at just people in our everyday. It could be on a college campus, it could be a professor, it could be a dean, it could be the chancellor, in a corporate setting, it could be, your boss or your boss's boss and so on. How would you recommend us approaching situations that are uncomfortable, but yet they're not willing to have a conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, neodiversity? There's a lot of examples that I can share, but I certainly want this to be about the group, the collective. But I will share just a short one. Several years ago, I was starting at a new company, really excited, and we flew out to the headquarters, and I was meeting my other colleagues. Most of them were remote, and so one of my new colleagues, I went to shake his hand and said, very nice to meet you, I'm Lyndenise, and he came and just grabbed my arm and he just touched my skin and he said, I've never met someone your color before. And so at that moment, it's terrifying, at that moment, like, it's just like, what do you say to that? How do you approach that situation? And so one of the things that I did is, again, instead of letting that anger or just snapping at them, I took a pause and I was just like, I'm going to let this go, but put a pause in it. More as like, I'm going to put a pin in this. And I ended up doing a presentation that we had to do, and it was like a little competition amongst colleagues. And it was really about higher education and discussing, the different types of institutions and how we approach them, talking about partnership opportunities. And I used that opportunity to talk about HBCUs. And when I was presented with the opportunity to have a platform, in this case, a corporate platform, I was able to then discuss, what is an HBCU? Why are they important? Let me show you where they're located, and just talking about diversity in that sense. And I know not a lot of people may have either the courage or the understanding or even the words to really, I would say, fight back in this case, or have that discussion. What are some tools or what are some things that you recommend people that may not really know where to start to really fight back?
Yes. Tools. Some of this is social skill development. But some of this is just having the words. So one of the things I talk about in all my books is a strategy for standing up to bigotry. And it's a very simple strategy. It says, you do something like this. You say, excuse me, but I find that inappropriate. I find it offensive. It hurts me. And you say it quietly. You don't get upset. You just say it quietly. And then you stop talking. That halts the moment. It shakes up the moment for the other person. So that's a strategy. Now, one of the problems is sometimes power relationships. Okay, so what do you do then? Are you willing to take the risk? Becomes part of the equation. And it's unfortunate that you have to work that out. If you're in an organization that has a bias reporting system, you use that. So it can be anonymous. But it can be a very tough moment. You handle it by way of a platform. That's a strategy. And what I'm getting at is this. You have to read the moment, you have to read the situation, and you have to figure out for yourself a productive strategy, if there is one. Do you have colleagues who can be allies? Do you have someone you can report this to in a way that it can get back to that person or get back to the organizational leadership, not as a personal vendetta, but as a way of saying this is something that the organization needs to work on. But the problem is it's a lot of responsibility put on the person who is aggrieved. Turns out, though, that's the situation we live in right now.
It was definitely difficult, but what I learned is that they learned at that moment when I was given the platform, because their perception of someone like me was that I was always going to be less than. And so I had to utilize a moment as a teaching moment, although I'm not an educator by no means on an academic platform, but I used that opportunity to educate my colleagues. And it was certainly impactful, not just to those that I was really trying to send the message to, but also to others, especially the leaders of the organization. And so it's just sometimes just difficult to really gather your thoughts and gather the right words to share.
I have a lot of experience that helps me, both as a social psychologist and the fact that I was in the military. But that doesn't mean I don't get caught in a moment where I have to really quickly navigate what's going on. So here's one of my best examples. My students always get me invited to give talks somewhere. And one of my students became an assistant pastor somewhere in Raleigh, and invited me to talk, and the church agreed that they wanted me to come to their Wednesday night luncheon thing, something. And so after teaching, I head downtown, I get to the place, I find my way into the church lunch area, and I'm looking around for where I'm gonna be. The problem is my former student, did not describe me. They knew Dr. Nacoste was coming. They didn't know Dr. Nacoste was a big, giant black man. So I'm standing there trying to figure out where I'm supposed, people getting coffee here, and a white man sees me and he looks up at me and he looks at me and he says, "Can I help you?" Like I'm completely out of place, right? Like I shouldn't even be there. What the hell are you doing here? I was like, wow. And I just looked at him and said, "Yeah, I'm your speaker for the evening. Where should I go?" You should have seen him. The awful psychological twisting that was going on. But that's a moment I had to navigate, because I could have just said, okay, I tell my students this, never forget that I was a sailor. I got other ways of handling this. But I didn't do that.
And we're thankful for that. And we're so grateful. We're so grateful. And so I think, again, we could go left, all these conversations that we have, and it's important to also understand that these conversations can be stressful, they can be exhausting, they can be disheartening. There could be moments that you just need to step away, and you've shared on multiple sessions where sometimes you need to choose who to speak to, who to engage with. You need to choose your battles. Sometimes not every battle is meant to be won at the moment, but if you plant those seeds, the idea is really to win the war.
That's right. Oh, very cool. I like that. No, I like that a lot. That is, not every moment is the whole war, if you want to put it in those terms. No. Some things, you deal with things that you can and that you can deal with productively. Why? Because we're building something. We're building something. And I love the way you put that.
Thank you. This is being recorded, so feel free to share with your classes.
Okay.
Awesome. There's another question I want to address. There's actually a lot of questions coming in, which is awesome. So glad that everyone is engaged this evening. The question is from one of the members is, as we, members of a less never oppressed group, learn to interact and lead us alongside our more diverse colleagues, is there such a thing as being too woke?
Oh, that's such a good question. So why is my book called To Live Woke? My book is called To Live Woke for two reasons. One of my students wrote a paper about the fact that nowadays, and I quote that paper in the book, there are people who want to be social justice warriors, but they exaggerate it and they're too woke. That got me paying attention to that language. And then I saw Trevor Noah on Facebook do this bit about being too woke. And he's right. Because what it means is that you think that you're always seeing social injustice now, because now you're aware and you don't want your Black friend and your gay and lesbian friend, and so you're paying hyper attention, and you're wrong. Let people handle their own stuff. So yeah, you can be, quote unquote, too woke. You exaggerate the moment when it's not necessary. Look, if you're saying that you're now learning to think about neurodiversity, learning to think about social justice and racial and other neurodiverse terms, that means you're learning. So be aware of that, sit back, listen, and learn. Don't act like, okay, I know enough now, let's go do it. No. Because no, people will be looking at you like, who are you? So you can be too woke.
Yeah, no, and I know exactly which Trevor Noah skit that you're talking about, but I just thought it was very, looking at it, some people, they will shy away from engaging because they feel like they might be too woke in how they approach. Right. And I think that it should be the opposite. It should be, there's always time to engage. You just need to make sure that it's a productive engagement, right? You don't have to, you don't want it to be, attacking one another. You mentioned last time about the use of white privilege, how as of, the terminology is now sometimes maybe even used as an attack. Some people feel that the term, calling someone Karen is, attacking them, right? And so I think it's about finding ways to have that productive conversation, but understand that you're not going to change their mind at that moment.
That's exactly right. So my training, and I mentioned this last time, is about how to create dialogue opportunities. That's what the Navy trained me to do. So I'm always learning what the language is, but I put aside pieces of the language that I know are not productive. They don't lead to real dialogue. That doesn't mean I'm ignoring that issue. It just means I'm not going to use that terminology because it shuts people down. You just asked the question about poor whites. The problem for poor whites is to say to a poor white person that you got white privilege. It's like, what are you talking about? Because they hear privilege. So there are other things to talk about with anybody. But you have to be careful about the language you use if you want to have productive dialogue and bring people into the dialogue.
And there's also defining. We talked about this a couple of minutes ago, just defining, looking at defunding the police, abolishing police. What is privilege, right? When we look at the word privilege, something, for example, I'm from the Latinx community, I'm Puerto Rican. I am privileged to be born an American citizen. So I understand and recognize my privilege of being born an American citizen. So although I am of the Latinx community, which is an umbrella for many communities, it's important for me to recognize my own privilege that I was born a US citizen.
Look, this is one of the things I talk to my students about, because the first time I was like, you got to talk about white privilege. You got to talk about it. I said, no, I don't. I said, you're a student at NC State, right? They go, yeah. You use all the resources here, right? They said, oh, yeah. I said, do you realize how few people get to do this? No matter your skin color? And the story I tell is coming out of Hunt Library, that magnificent, love that place. I was coming out one morning after I'd been writing, and I saw this young man who had taken my course, a young African man, truly African, not African-American, African. Dark skin, shiny dark skin, beautiful skin. And he's walking towards me and he sees me and says, hey, Dr. Nacoste, how are you? I said, hey, how are you? I said, oh, you go in the library, use the library. He said, oh, yeah. I said, so do you come here often? He said, oh, yes, I'm here every day. And does not think about the privilege of that. Look, there's lots of different privilege in America. Just the idea of being American is a privilege. So that's why the term white privilege just kind of dwindles away in terms of its usefulness. We can talk about legacies of racism. That's easy.
And it's also understanding that when to use your privilege for good, right? Okay, great, thanks. So we have another question, which I think definitely just ties into our discussion this evening. We have sex education as part of the North Carolina core curriculum. When and how will we make diversity training or diversity education part of our core curriculum for our students from kindergarten to senior year?
How many jobs do I have? Wait, I'm a psychology professor. Now, when will we have? Okay, I don't know. My students ask this. Dr. Nacoste, when can we make sure that blood done sign my name is read by every high school student in the world? I was like, okay. I really wish that could happen, but we have to educate a whole bunch of people, a whole generation of people about what real education looks like. I mean, just the idea of talking about African Americans having been enslaved is disturbing to some people. They don't want people to read books like To Kill a Mockingbird, which I find a kind of mild story, given my experience in the deep south of Louisiana. It's lovely, but it's not a big deal to me. But some people are completely freaked out about books like that. And they don't want their children. Yeah, but that's the history of America. That's not African-American history. That's the history of this country. So if we're going to start, we have to start with educating kids about the true history of race in America. And we can do that in age-appropriate ways along the way. And that then becomes diversity education training.
There's also another book by Abram Kendi. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He actually has a child's book, that talks about, the importance of diversity, but from a child's perspective, which I think is really important. But, looking 10, 20 years ago, these books didn't exist. And Toni Morrison said it perfectly. Of course, this is just essentially, it's like if you're looking for a book and it doesn't exist, you have to write it. That's your space to write it. And so I think that that's really important in situations like this, because now we're seeing books, we're seeing, people that look like us, people that are brown and Black authors, but there's still a huge gap. I was a business student and we don't really see a lot of business books written by people of color. And so I think that that's also really important in an academic setting, is to diversify the books and the authors that are read by our students in order to add to that discussion, and not just specifically say everyone's required as a freshman to take Diversity 101.
Oh, right. No, yeah. No, one of the interesting things about what's happening now with books, novels, I'm thinking of, speculative fiction. I mean, there are writers of color now putting out major works of speculative fiction. And even on TV, HBO is running Lovecraft Country, which I can't watch, but but I did watch Watchmen.
Mm.
Watchmen starts with the Tulsa racial massacre. My jaw dropped. I was like, what am I watching? Okay, but so you have to be ready. But there's so many different ways now that we can use the creative arts and are starting to, but you're so right, there's a gap. I mean, as a 70-year-old Black man, I actually emailed a couple of African-American writers just to say, thank you. Because when I was a kid, you did not exist. You did not exist. And I'm reading all kind of young adult novels because of this.
And it's really important. I try to diversify also my reading. Most of my reading tends to be, people of color. And now there's others that are coming within business and other industries. I know that it was mentioned at the beginning that I did my master's in international political economy, and really the focus of my work there, just briefly sharing, I actually spent a summer in South Africa, and really the focus of my research was how during apartheid, kind of that inequality, that struggle between races was then post-apartheid, then reflecting within gender differences within the home, because there's such a it's just like a power within races. And then of course, post-apartheid, then we have like this power within, this power struggle within homes that then made women and children more susceptible to be trafficked. And so there's this huge kind of domino effect that a lot of people don't realize that is the basis of fear, right? Which is a lot of what you speak about. And so I think that it's certainly important to also address that, as we're talking about these books and as we talk about this curriculum, it still comes from the home. And I think that the biggest discussion, some of the questions here, so I'll just kind of group a few of them, is, how can we have these productive discussions, especially when your parents, you're a young person and your parents completely disagree, or their viewpoint is very different than yours. I know we're discussing as adults, but let's look at it from the point of view as a young person that's struggling to have these conversations with their families.
My students ask me about this all the time at the end of the semester. I said, wait a minute, Dr. Nacoste, and I've actually put it in a lecture. I said, now you got to go home. And I have changed you. I have made you absolutely more sensitive to these issues than you've ever been. What are you going to do now when you go home? So what do you do when you go home? You take the learning with you, but you don't take the learning with you with the idea that you're going to change everybody at home. When issues come up, speak your mind, speak in the eye, and then let it go. Don't get the idea that you're going to change grandpa. But you keep using this phrase that I really like, plant the seed. All you can do back home is let people know what you believe when it's appropriate. You don't just go home and start lecturing people. When it's appropriate, when a topic comes up, and they're going to look at you funny, they may get mad at you. Say your piece, and then let it go. That's really all you can do back at home as a young adult, because you're not going to change home. Home is an interesting group, you see. Now I'm being a social psychologist. The group dynamic of home is that even though it's for you in your heart, your home, you're not part of that group in the same way you were when you left. That group went on functioning without you. They've maintained some norms without you. Those norms are stronger than you are. So you have to recognize that reality. And when you go home, speak your mind when it's appropriate, and then let it go.
And how would you help someone have this conversation when they too come from a background of family of color. As the saying goes, not all skin folk is kinfolk. I think that's also important to address because it's difficult, you know, and I'll speak of course of the community that I'm most familiar with is the Latinx community. We come in all shades, we come in all backgrounds, and it's really difficult to have a conversation, you know, with someone, let's say they have a different political view or they do have some of these biases, these microaggressions. How do we address our community that you would say, hey, you know, you have a similar background than I do. So why is it that you don't necessarily see it through the same lens that I do? So I think it's important to address that not all skin folk are kinfolk.
One of the things I talk about is between group problems and within group problems. Within group problems are very powerful. And they're powerful because we make more assumptions. And that gets us in trouble. Because we're making the assumption that everybody looks like me. Well, we got this. No, we don't, because everybody has different social experiences. So some people are a lot angrier and are filled with a lot more anti-group feeling about white people, anti-group feeling about gays and lesbians, anti-group feeling about okay, and that comes out in bigoted language. That's within group. And so there we need all these social skills that we've been talking about. Again, speak your mind, be productive in the dialogue, don't let people shut you down, but also don't engage in this hyper angry kind of language and conversation. So here's a story for you. When I was in the Navy, it was an awful time. Race riots aboard ships carrying weapons of mass destruction. And sometimes people forget that means that it was not just white sailors attacking black sailors, it was black sailors attacking white sailors. And it was a time when black sailors felt like all black sailors had to have the same orientation. Okay, that's a problem right there. I came up with a different orientation given my father's way of being in the world and working on these issues because he worked cross-racially. And so I was operating in a different way, even before my training as a racial awareness facilitator. But people noticed that and were not sure about me. But one buddy, a man who became my buddy, he and I talked a lot, and it seemed to help him. I didn't know how much. 40 years later, I had an interaction with that man. And he said to me, "You saved my life." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I had a racial chip on my shoulder, and you showed me I didn't need that to be successful." That was simply planting a seed, as you say. That really is very powerful within group as well. People are watching. People are watching. People are listening. And sometimes you have to pull people up short, but that's necessary sometimes.
Absolutely. So Dr. Nacoste, I know we still have a few minutes, but I just wanted to open this up to you to really, you know, hear from you what you want your legacy to be the day that you decide to step away from the podium, the day that you decide to enjoy all the, you know, work that you've done throughout the years and all the lives that you've impacted. What should we know? What should the audience know? Those that will be watching on YouTube. What will your Dr. Nacoste legacy be?
Believe it or not, you're the second person to ask me that today. So that means I need to think about this, but I've already thought about it. And what I said to the person today was, she said, "What will be your legacy?" And I said, "My legacy is already alive and well. My students, that's my legacy." When the Black Lives Matter started to resurge after the hideous murder of George Floyd, even before that, I was getting evidence of this, but then it became very, very clear. I was getting emails, people were asking me for Zoom meetings to talk about what they had learned in my class and how that was helping them now to engage in a productive way. That's my legacy. That's my legacy of people who are now human resource managers, people now who are finishing medical school, people now who have just gotten their law degree, people now who, and they all have been trained in the ideas of neurodiversity and what it can do to us. That's my legacy. I am happy with that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nacoste. I know that this has been short for me, but the last two sessions have certainly felt like an education, and I feel like I've definitely been your student. And so thank you so much.
I have enjoyed you so much, Lyndenise. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll hand it back to alumni engagement. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And of course, a special thank you to Dr. Nacoste for sharing his knowledge and for allowing us to be part of his legacy.
Yes, thank you both again so much. Just a huge thank you to y'all for taking the time to sit and talk through some of these really, really big and definitely important topics. And thank you all who are here tonight for joining us on behalf of the NC State Alumni Association. You're definitely going to want to make sure that you join us for the next session on November 10th at 6:30. It will be during Red and White Week, and there will be a special update from Chancellor Woodson at the very beginning on some topics that this group especially is going to want to hear. Registration will remain open, so please encourage your friends, family, and coworkers to join us. Thank you all again, and go Pack!
Go Pack!